Welcome to the webinar, Evidence Expectation by Standard Guidelines. The presentation that you are viewing has been prepared by and is the property of the Middle States Commission on Higher Education. Reproduction of this presentation is expressly prohibited without prior written consent by Middle States Commission on Higher Education. For permission requests, please email MSCHE at president@msche.org. For any questions about an institution's accreditation status or for additional information about Middle States Commission on Higher Education standard of accreditation, requirements of affiliation, policies and procedures, and applicable federal regulatory requirements, you should contact your Middle States Commission on Higher Education staff. Always seek the advice of your institution's assigned Vice President Liaison with any questions specific to your institution. This presentation is not intended as a substitute for professional advice from Middle States staff, and use of the presentation does not guarantee any specific accreditation outcome. Good afternoon. I am Dr. Terrence Peavy, Vice President for Institutional Field Relations at Middle States. I'm joined by my colleagues, Dr. Sean McKittrick, Vice President for Institutional Field Relations, and Dr. Christopher Malone, Associate Provost at Farmingdale State College, State University of New York. In the time that we have together, we hope to achieve the following learning goals. By the end of this presentation, we hope that you will be able to understand more about the purposes of evidence expectation and how it's used to lead to efficient collection and presentation of data in both self-study narratives and an institution's use of evidence inventory approaches. Number two, review how the use of evidence expectation document can be useful through both streamlining and achieving focus through the use of evidence inventory for documentation and for the development of evidence-based narrative and self-study reports. And lastly, demonstrate how one institution has employed, one, a documentation approach that directly and more efficiently leverages the evidence inventory, and two, use data now found in the evidence expectation to focus on subpopulations to engage in continuous quality improvement. The evidence expectation by standard document available on the MSCHE website at www.msche.org is committed to evidence-based decision-making, consistency, and transparency in the assessment of institutional compliance with the standards for accreditation, requirements of affiliation, policies and procedures, and applicable federal regulatory requirements. The purpose of this document is to provide a list of minimum expectations for the type of evidence that an institution must collect, analyze, and submit as a part of this self-reflective accreditation review process. This document is not designed to replace the self-reflection and analysis that is a critical component of the accreditation process. Importantly, the list of evidence is based on an analysis of actual institutional submissions and reflects the evidence that institutions and peer evaluators have found most relevant and useful during the accreditation activities. This document is a companion document to the Standards for Accreditation and Requirement of Affiliation, 14th edition. The purpose of the evidence expectation is to provide a listing of evidence institutions are expected to use in self-study reports. There are, of course, valid reasons for adaptation, but these expectations should provide guidance. These do not replace self-reflection and analysis. Institutions are expected to support their claims of compliance with Middle States expectations with evidence, accompanied by evidence-based narrative, and with proof of use of such evidence in continuous quality improvement. The evidence listed in the evidence expectation came as a result of policy analysis, quantitative analysis of some of the most common evidence used by institutions, and qualitative analysis of the most common approaches. When reviewing and using this document, we recommend that institutions start by reviewing their mission and goals within their institutional context. After doing that, it is recommended that you go to each standard with their criteria on the left column and identify related documentation and evidence on the right column. Here is an example of an evidence expectation document with the standard, in this case, standard 1, mission and goals. with standard 1 criteria to the left and the evidence expectation to the right. We note that the right column contains documents, data, and qualitative assessment information gleaned from the aforementioned process. As a reminder, the evidence expectation document can be found on www.msche.org. They last revised their mission statement with evidence of participation and approval by members of the governing body. They should also provide evidence of sample communication, meaning a representative number of communications, evidencing communication or publication of the institution stakeholders, both internal and external. In many cases, institutions do this by presenting the information in the evidence inventory or in the relevant self-study report chapter that shows the institution's policy of regular review of its mission and its process. Institutions also document alignment between elements of mission, such as keywords, phrases, and themes, and representative numbers of budget requests documenting alignment between mission, strategic planning, and budgeting. I will now welcome Dr. McKittrick to the presentation to discuss additional aspects to consider when utilizing the evidence expectation by standard document. Dr. McKittrick.
Thank you, Terrence, and good afternoon, everybody. As noted earlier, the evidence expectations are meant to be a tool to enhance efficiency and usefulness. We note that evidence expectations contain areas of critical focus, including a continuing focus on mission and institutional and unit goals, educational effectiveness assessment, diversity, equity, and inclusion commission policies, and federal and state regulations. Now, where applicable, institutions should use consistent and reasonably valid data over time and tie the measures collected in the AIU to their evidence-based approach where warranted. This would include student achievement indicators such as graduation rates, financial indicators such as through the presentation of changes in net assets and composite financial indices, and headcount and student FTE. It's expected that institutions, where possible, present information over time accompanied by an evidence-based narrative so institutional stakeholders and evaluators can best evaluate compliance with commission expectations and key institutional claims. For many institutions, these data are already available, albeit somewhat late, in IPEDS, the college scorecard, and from other official sources. To make the information most useful to evaluators, the commission, and to your own internal and external stakeholders, institutions should provide the latest data and should provide 3 to 4 years of data followed by an evidence-based narrative that lends itself to continuous quality improvement. We also note that institutions are responsible for developing and using the evidence inventory, an existing tool to house and organize evidence. But remember that the purpose of the evidence inventory is not merely to create a repository of documents, important as those documents might be. It's also a place that contains evidence where evaluators can confirm and clarify what they read in the evidence-based narratives found in the self-study report itself. Evidence is used to support analyses found in the self-study report. For example, when writing an evidence-based narrative regarding attention to diversity, equity, and inclusion, an institution, its steering committee and working groups, for example, collects the information found in the evidence requirements booklet. It might place where relevant policies, procedures, and an institution's structures or units that document an institution's expectations regarding DEI. And then within the self-study narrative, present data such as 12-month student headcount by gender, race, ethnicity, and other critical subpopulations. And then subsequently include a narrative showing how the institution has been successful or how it is using such information to continuously improve. We recommend using institutional research and other offices at your institutions to ensure evidence is available, valid, reliable, and consistently applied according to established institutional protocols. We also advise ensuring that the file names are well labeled and easy to reference. We note that not all evidence in the evidence expectations document apply to every institutional mission or type. For example, graduate-only institutions would not have undergraduate graduation and retention rates. When using evidence, it is advisable to cross-reference across the standards, uploading data once, and to utilize best practices to maintain data privacy. Always be careful not to disaggregate data into such small groups or components as to make it easier to identify individuals. When selecting relevant levels of disaggregation, do so in ways that are appropriate to mission. It is always a good idea to identify data sources, the time frame used, especially when using trend data, and briefly specify the methodologies used to develop an evidence-based approach. When displaying data over time, it is always preferable to present information, usually for our purposes of self-study, over a 4-year period. When using policies or procedures as evidence, it is important to discuss implementation over time. And remember also that institutions can choose certain measures not listed in the evidence requirements booklet, but the reason for doing so should be clearly explained. Now to turn things over to Terrence, who will bring us to our next point.
Thank you so much. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Christopher Malone to the presentation. Dr. Malone has been the Associate Provost at Farmingdale State College since September of 2021, where he assists the Senior Vice President and Provost in overseeing the academic mission of the college, providing direct supervision of all academic units, support services, and operations, and coordinating all academic programs. Dr. Malone has a quarter-century of experience in higher ed and public service. Prior to his arrival at Farmingdale, Dr. Malone served as the founding dean of the School of Arts and Sciences at Molloy College. Dr. Malone also serves as Farmingdale State College's Accreditation Liaison Officer. Farmingdale State College's next self-study is scheduled for 2028-2029. We are appreciative of Dr. Malone's participation in today's webinar. Dr. Malone.
Thank you, Terrence. Thank you, Sean. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really happy to be here. And what I would like to do is walk you through how we're organizing our evidence in our evidence inventory with the new guidelines. I want to use the area of focus of DEI and talk about how we map what we're doing with one specific aspect of DEI, that is retention, through the standards, through the criteria, and then back to the evidence inventory. And then lastly, discuss a little bit about how we're focusing on continuous improvement through that entire process. The first thing here on the slide that I want to focus on, however, is the wonderful framework that Middle States gives us in terms of how to get to the evidence inventory and what its use and what its purpose is. So last year I was in this same webinar, or I was watching it, and Sean talked about these 4 steps, and that's really the framework that I want to focus on here. First of all, the policies. What is expected of the institution as it relates to the mission and the policy that supports that mission? The procedures, how is it done? Thirdly, the structures, who or what is doing all of this work in the procedures and how it maps back to the policies. And then lastly, with the evidence, what shows that it has been done and is continuously improving. So for me, I've used this 4-step process in really organizing the evidence inventory, but more importantly, using the evidence inventory to work our way back to the conceptual issues of the mission of the institution and the policies. So let me talk a little bit about how we organize our evidence inventory. And on the next slide, you'll see a screenshot, which I know you can't read any of the text, and that's not important. But what I want to show you is how we organize the evidence inventory in 2021 and how we will going into 2028. It's a big spreadsheet. The first column, column A, has 1,438 pieces of evidence that we organized. So this is, our reference list, if you will. It's not the actual inventory itself, but it does link to all the pieces of evidence. And if you go to the next slide, you will zoom in on the rows and the subject matters that we are, organizing around. So we have the document title and the number. We number it from 1 to 1438. However many pieces of evidence you have, you can certainly do it this way. The file name, the description, the type, the date that it was documented or created. And the original file name. So, sometimes you have a document that might be called IPEDS and you want to change the name for the evidence inventory. And then the lower screenshot is how we then map all of the evidence to the standards. And as most of you know, there was a COVID addendum through those years. So we had a column for that. And essentially, this is just basic bookkeeping, which piece of evidence maps to which standard, and then you sort of take it from there. All of the evidence itself is contained in a shared file, and if you go to the next slide, you'll see just a screenshot of that. Basic stuff. I'm sure this is how you're thinking about organizing your evidence. We've created a series of folders in my office, and as we collect evidence, we're putting them into that folder according to the guidelines that Middle States has provided. The next slide is just another screenshot of standard 1, couple of the documents. So I think you get the point here is that you want to organize the content, but you also want to create that file that gives you all of the where you can find the evidence. And this becomes incredibly important when you're writing the narrative, as Sean was discussing, because you want to reference each of those pieces and they become your footnote, if you will. And I'm going to come back to that point. So let me transition and talk a little bit about how we're doing, how we're taking the area of focus of DEI on the next slide, and really, getting down into the evidence to support our mission as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So this is our mission statement. I'm going to read it very quickly, at least the top part of this. FSC, Farmingdale recognizes and celebrates diversity, equity, and inclusion as foundations for, number 1, comprehensive recruitment and retention. Number 2, curriculum development. 3, collaborative governance and administrative planning and leadership. And lastly, diverse campus activities and programs. So our mission statement as it relates to DEI has 4 components. And what we want to do is make sure that we ask those 4 questions. What is expected? The procedures, how is it done? The structures, who is doing it? And then where's your evidence? So let me take one piece of the first element, that is retention. If you go to the next slide, you'll see the org chart that I've created to map this through to the evidence. So there are your 4 pieces of the mission of our DEI office and our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts here. And then you have recruitment and retention. The next slide will show you really the policies and the procedures. That is, what is it? The procedures and the structures. How is it done and who's doing what? So if you look at retention at Farmingdale, it's pretty much run through a whole series of offices. We have the math and writing centers, and they oversee our math placement and writing placement test for incoming students. We have a first-year seminar. This is the first year at Farmingdale that we actually have ramped up a first-year seminar. Most of our first-year students are doing a first-year seminar this year, but in the next couple of years, every first-year incoming student will have a first-year experience class. And that's part of this retention effort, obviously. The transfer services, those students coming in, whether they have an associate's degree or whether they're transferring in from another institution after their first year or what have you, that is an important part of the process. The AAIC tutoring, math and writing centers, AAIC at Farmingdale stands for the Academic Advising and Information Center. That office reports to me, and they oversee a lot of the policies and a lot of the procedures as it relates to retention. We have an early warning system. Maybe your institution has something similar. Weeks 5 and 6, we ask our faculty to tell us how the students are doing in the class. That gets mapped into the Office of Advising. That data then is collected by me, and then we take some actions on it, and I'll come back to that. We have academic warning, which is basically a probation forgiveness program for first-time full-time students. If they don't have a 2.0 in their first semester, we put them on what we call academic warning for the spring semester, and then we have a whole series of interventions that we document, that we engage in order to try to get the students back on, a solid path. But that is an important ingredient in our retention efforts. And then after the first year, if they don't have a 2.0, there's an academic probation process as well. We have a whole host of student support programs that oversee hundreds of students at the college, and they also are an important and integral part of our retention efforts. So I think those of you in New York State are familiar with C-STEP. Those of you in the SUNY system know the EOP program. It's an educational opportunity program, and of course the federal program TRIO. In the SUNY system, we just initiated what's called ACE. It is another support program for either first generation students or Pell eligible students. We also have a program that we call the RAM program, which stands for Research Aligned Mentorship, about 800 students that get holistic advising and undergraduate research mentoring that the college, has institutionalized. It was a grant years ago. All of these offices, all of these activities really are mapping back to retention, and then we are mapping retention back to how we're doing with the DEI, area of focus. So if you go to the next slide, Terrence, you will see then that we need to map this forward to the standards and the criteria that Middle States sets for us. So I put in the red block some of the criteria of standard 4. You see criteria 1B, 1C, and 1E. I don't have to read these to you, but this is where all of that work on retention as it relates to DEI really starts to come into contact with the standards and with the criteria that we're expected to meet. So once we have all of this and we've conceptualized how you get to that, then it's a matter of then collecting the evidence inventory. And then the next slide, you'll see how we sort of pull all this together. And this is just related to one very small aspect of the entire enterprise of the narrative. This is DEI as it relates to retention. You see here at the top row, policies, procedures, structures, and evidence. That's our framework. You see going down the first column on the policies, how it relates to criteria 1B of standard 4, how it relates to 1C of standard 4, and 1E of standard 4. Standard 4, and then you have your procedures in the second column. You have your structures, who's doing what, and then all of the documents in that last column are our pieces of evidence that get put into the evidence inventory to support the standard in terms of student experience in standard 4, and just a couple of these criteria. So this is just one piece of DEI, and obviously it gets very complicated, but if you keep a clear eye about this and you kind of, just get your inventory right and get your structures right, all of your DEI can certainly be mapped. And of our 4 pieces of our mission, what I'm doing is doing this kind of exercise with each of those 4 areas of our DEI mission. Lastly, we try to map it all the way back to continuous improvement. So this is a chart of our key performance indicators that we outlined in our strategic enrollment management plan. And very quickly, this indicates to you over the next 5 years where we want to be with first and second year retention and 4- and 6-year graduation rates. We want to push our first year retention to 85% from about 81, 82%. We want to push our second year retention to 75% from about 65% or 67% right now. We want to push our 6-year graduation rates up to 65% from the mid to upper 50s. The 4th column here relates to an associate's program we have called Liberal Arts and Sciences. We retain, or we matriculate, about 40% of those students into a baccalaureate program at Farmingdale. we want to see that number pushed up to 55%. And then lastly, our 4-year graduation rates, which are hovering around the mid-30s, we'd like to get that into the mid-40s within the next 5 years. So all of that retention work that I was talking about as it relates to DEI specifically, but certainly generally in the retention, really then maps to our efforts at continuous improvement and our 5-year strategic plan and our 5-year strategic enrollment plan. So that's kind of how we pull all this together. And, you know, to try to wrap this up, I'll give you some final thoughts as I take a sip of water. The first thing I would recommend is, you know, just take a breath. There's a lot, you know, in your evidence. As I said, we had over 1,400 pieces of evidence. You can't start to compile that in the last year, you know, or the last 2 years. You really got to start, you know, now. And as we look at our horizon of 2028 for our next self-study, we're already doing this. So just kind of stay calm, carry on, and collect the data or the evidence as you go forward. The second thing I would recommend to you is to think big, but take small steps, or to put it another way, start with the conceptual and then move to the specific as it relates to evidence. So to come back to this framework that Middle States gives us, you know, retention is a big conceptual thing. DEI is a big conceptual thing. And if you, you know, kind of get stuck on that, you'll never start to chop it up and really break it down and what are the constituent parts of it. So I think this framework really helps you to do that. So starting with the mission or the policies, moving to the procedures, moving to the structures, moving through to the evidence that supports all of that is really key. And if you try to start from the reverse, then I think you're going to get stuck in the mud as well. And that's my last point, which is that the evidence inventory is your bibliography. It's not the monograph. It's not the narrative, as Sean was saying. And I think this is obvious to people, but if you try to start with the evidence inventory and not with the story you want to tell about your institution, I think you're gonna get stuck a little bit. And I think there's so much evidence that I know you're trying to gather that it become overwhelming. So the evidence inventory, and the reason why we document all of that in that that Excel spreadsheet, is that those pieces of evidence, we reference them in the narrative and they become our footnotes, and they serve the purpose of supporting the narrative and not become the narrative itself. So I'll leave it there, Terrence. I'll turn it back to you, and I'm happy to try to answer questions as they come up.
Thank you for your remarks, Dr. Malone. And before we get into the Q&A, and just a reminder, please put all your questions in the Q&A icon that's right below your screen. But before we start that part of the process, I just want to revisit our learning goals for today. It is our hope that this webinar has provided clarity on the purpose of the evidence expectation by standard document, while also seeing its many approaches in the self-study process. Lastly, we are thankful for Dr. Malone's portion of the presentation, where he demonstrated how Farmingdale State College engages in continuous quality improvement through the analysis of institutional data. If you haven't done so already, our annual conference is coming up in a few short weeks, December 4th through the 6th. We have a tremendous lineup set for every attendee. Obviously, a great time to network, to interact not only with Middle State staff, but with other colleagues. So if you haven't done so, please register, and we look forward to seeing you there. On behalf of Middle States and the panelists today, we want to thank you for attending the webinar, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event.
Take
Thank you so
care,
much.
everyone. Bye-bye.